Hi, Susie.
Hi, Susie.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How you doing? Hi, Carol.
Good.
Hi,
Hi, Hootie.
Hi, Rabbi Popky, and hi,
Hi, everybody. Hi,
Hi, Ricky.
Hi, Ricky.
And here comes Charlotte.
Does the window behind me bother anybody?
No.
No, it gives you an appropriate halo.
yeah, that's right.
Hi, Charlotte.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good
How are
morning.
you?
Good. How are you doing?
Gotta leave.
Very well,
Oh,
To
thanks.
you, so
Very
Great.
well.
Rabbi, did you see my message about
Yes.
Joel? Okay.
And I saw Joel's note too. So,
Yeah, right.
okay. So no
Sorry.
sleep tonight. That's all right. Um, okay. I'm going to start sharing the screen. I know Shell's not able to make it today,
Okay.
unfortunately. And, it should be said that Matot Maseh, being a double portion, has certainly got a lot in it.
In it.
We're not really going to be doing the parasha justice, to be honest. I mean, after all, we have the allotment of the land to the tribes. We have the list of all of the locations, the itinerary through the wilderness, which is, kind of appropriate for us at this period as we're dealing with what hopefully will be the end of the COVID, but we're still in it. And, like the Israelites marking all of the places, where have we been? Where have we come from? What have we experienced? What have we lost? What have we gained? It's a lot of important thoughts from our parasha. We're actually going to be looking at one mitzvah from our parasha. It's one mitzvah, or what our sages derived from this parasha, in particular, Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides. And as we'll talk about, he added this in his glosses and his notes to Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot. Rambam composed a book, Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Mitzvot, outlining all 613 mitzvot. Needless to say, not everyone agreed with that list. Among them was Ramban. So he wrote a number of editions, and this is one of those mitzvot. And we'll go from Ramban and his look at this to take a look back at what the rabbis had to say, at least some very famous passages. One could go through rabbinic literature and find much, much more, but just chose some of the most famous passages that almost everyone quotes. And then a couple of looks at some modern statements. At least I hope we'll have time to do that. So first of all, let's just take this one chunk and see what it is that Ramban learns from this. This is Bamidbar, chapter 33, beginning with verse 50 to the end of the chapter. Who would like to read?
I will.
Okay, thank you, Susie. Let me just
In the steeps
steps of Moab, in the rocky hills. And
okay. In the steeps of Moab, all at the Jordan near Jericho, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You shall destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten objects, and you shall demolish all their cult places. And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess. You shall apportion the land among yourselves by lot, clan by clan. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, they shall be his. And you shall have your portions according to your ancestral tribes."
That's important, by the way, because we have kind of an addition to the story of Benot Tzlov. Remember that Benot Tzlov were told, yes, you can inherit from your father. But then the members of her tribe, of their tribe, Menashe, said, wait a minute, if they can marry anyone and they've got the land, well, then part of our land may go to some other tribe if they marry someone from another tribe. So they are told they have to marry someone from within their tribe. But, wherever the lot falls from, that shall be his. You shall have your portions according to your ancestral tribes. Kind of God has this all planned out. Okay, go on.
But if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, those whom you shall allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land in which you live, so that I will do to you what I plan to do to them.
Okay. So overall, what is this passage talking about? Actually, before we get to the Ramban.
It's
Taking
about
possession of the land.
Yeah, taking possession of the land. It's a very, crucial issue. After all, they are brought out of Egypt. And of course, they are brought to Sinai and enter into the Brit with God. But a part of that is they are to get the land. They're ultimately going to, as we always call it in English, the promised land. A very, very important element, going to Eretz Yisrael. Any other elements that are there?
Rabbi,
So,
ladies first.
all right. Okay, Ricky, then Yehudi.
It's one of the women.
They have to get rid of everyone who's there, including all the idols and everything.
Right. They
So
have to,
can start fresh on a clean slate.
yeah, they have to dispossess the inhabitants. And really, one of the major reasons for dispossessing the inhabitants are that, you got to get rid of them because they will come along with their religion, with their idols, and they will afflict the Israelites and turn them away from God. Okay, Yehudi?
I was just going to echo what Ricky said, but I just want to make a point that the main force of this is the dispossession. In other words, the way this is being presented, it's not so, God is telling you, just like I promised, you're going to get the land and you'll possess it. But that's like a land grant. This land grant is conditional on you dispossessing the people who live there. If you don't dispossess the people who live there, then you're calling the whole land grant into question. Because the very fact that you're going to be sitting side by side with idol worshipers and other people who do, things that, the whole purpose of your being there is to root that out, means that if you don't dispossess the people who live there now, that means kick them out of the country, okay? Then your whole land grant is going to be called into question. And Hashem even says, I'll do to you what I plan to do to them.
Mm-hmm. And that will be a line that Rashi and then later Sforno will follow. And, some contemporary commentators as well. I don't mean contemporary commentators on the Bible, as we'll see, we'll talk about it, how that translates, how the mitzvah that Ramban talks about will translate into contemporary times. But Ramban is going to focus on a verse that, certainly doesn't stand apart from its context at all, but it's and certainly also includes the notion that one of the crucial elements here is dispossessing the Canaanites. But he's going to take it in a slightly different. He's going to take a slightly different emphasis. So who would like to continue? This is again Ramban.
Help me.
Okay, thank you. I don't know who said that.
Carol?
Oh, okay, Carol.
In my opinion, this is a positive commandment in which he is commanding them to dwell in the land and inherit it, because he has given it to them, and they should not reject the inheritance of God. Thus, if the thought occurs to them to go and conquer the land of Shinar or the land of Assyria or any other country and to settle therein, they are thereby transgressing the commandment of God.
So what is Ramban emphasizing?
That you have to live there in the land of God.
Yes, in the land that God is giving them.
It's given
Right.
them.
Yeah. So here, it's where it's, and we're going to see it's kind of a very important point that he begins. In my opinion, this is a positive commandment. Al da'ati zo mitzvat aseh. And this is where his additions to Rambam come in. Rambam does not include yeshivat haaretz, settling, living in the land, as one of the commandments. And Ramban does, and specifically in the land. So Ramban as well would have rejected the idea of moving the Jews to Uganda. Okay, go on.
And that which our rabbis have emphasized, the significance of the commandment of settling in the land of Israel, and that it is forbidden to leave it, and the fact that they consider a woman who does not want to emigrate with her husband to live in the land of Israel as a rebellious wife, and likewise the man. The source of all these statements is here in this verse, where we have been given this commandment, for this verse constitutes a positive commandment. This commandment he repeats in many places, such as go in and possess the land.
Yeah, so again, he's emphasizing that this is a positive commandment. And he's makes reference to the fact that the rabbis seem to emphasize this in a certain way. And now the other way, which I think in many ways is the pshat, because it's the overall context. He quotes Rashi's comment and then dismisses it, but go ahead.
Rashi, however, explains, and you shall take possession of the land. If you dispossess of of its inhabitants, then you will be able to dwell therein and to remain there. But if not, you will not be able to remain in it. But our interpretation of the verse is the principal one.
Yeah, so Ramban being very modest there, he has a particular sense of what the mitzvah is. But as Yehudi mentioned, as Ricky mentioned, when you look at the overall context, there is very much an emphasis on disinheritance comes through dispossessing the inhabitants and removing their influence. Yehudi, you have your hand raised?
I think another point we have to take is this mitzvah is counted by Ramban here because this is the first place he can find it being said. But he mentions that actually, it's repeated in Sefer Devarim at least 10 times. In other words, it's just the way this mitzvah system works. You always list the mitzvah in the very first place you see it, okay? So the end result of that is that even if you see it again later, and what is said later is actually much more forceful than the original statement, somehow the mitzvah is always going to get listed in the section that was where it was first mentioned, even though that section might, like, for example, in Parshat Re'eh, it makes it very clear, no ands, ifs, and buts about it, without all this, there's a lot of purple prose in this paragraph, Elsewhere, the statement is as clear as day. And the fact that Rambam doesn't list it as a separate mitzvah is because he sees it as a prerequisite for all the mitzvot. That's all. It's not that he doesn't see a need for listing it as a separate mitzvah. I've never been able to really, let's just say, attach all of that much significance. The whole bit with listing mitzvot is a bit of a parlor game. Once somebody got up and said there was 613 mitzvot, then everybody had to get on the board and say, well, I'm going to count them, and not one of them agrees with the next one. So, so as a practical matter, I don't really think this is of great significance. The Torah assumes that people are going to live in Eretz Israel, and that if they're not there, it's because they've been punished and exiled.
Correct. But, I think that the whole issue of living in Israel and understanding it as a mitzvah does come up, as we'll see again in the tradition. And we have many statements that state that very, very strongly. We're about to take a look at some of the rabbinic materials, and these are the most well-known rabbinic materials. And the fact is, if you look throughout rabbinic literature, you'll find many other statements. And the whole idea of living in Israel actually becomes conditioned partially simply by everyone's historical experiences. But, there is a Zionist strain, a very strong Zionist strain in our tradition. Part of the argument, I would say, against some of the left wing and the Palestinians use the argument that somehow Israel is a colonialist enterprise. No, maybe if you just take the idea of dispossessing the inhabitants, but if you totally forget 2,500 years of Jewish experience and seeing Israel as central to the Jewish experience, it's not a colonial enterprise. This was where we wanted to be. This is where we were thrown out, and we never lost that connection. And now we'll take a look at some of the very strong biblical statements. So who would like to read? First of all, famous quote from the
Tannaitic statements, right?
Yes.
Okay.
The other statements from the Talmud will actually also be Tannaitic statements, which is kind of important. Well, I'll give it away. It's kind of important because all the Tannaitic sources were written in Eretz Yisrael. By the time we get to the Bavli, you have a lot of statements, even if they're still so totally pro Eretz Yisrael, they're saying, you should never leave Israel. You should also never leave Babylonia, or that, it's better to be in Babylonia than Israel. Of course, that was the changing historical circumstances of these communities. But it is important to point out their Tannaitic sources.
Wait. I don't think you can find a Tannaitic source that says it's forbidden to leave Babel. You could only
no. That's what I'm saying. It's the early it's the early rabbinic sources, the Tannaitic sources, which were all written in Eretz Yisrael. But you get to the Bavli, I didn't bring in those statements. Because we only have an hour. I just wanted to focus on how this
Probably
particular
like Jews in America. America's the promised land.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little later. Yeah, it's a good point because we're going to talk about it later. Okay, so first of all, back to the Tosefta. The Tosefta, remember, is a companion volume to the Mishnah. It was edited according to tradition after the Mishnah, although, as a number of scholars have pointed out, my teachers, the parts of the Tosefta probably are earlier than parts of the Mishnah. My feeling is that there was a whole body of these oral traditions, if you will, Torah Shabbat Peh, that were eventually edited into two documents. The first one became the more authoritative, the Mishnah, and hence the Tosefta literally means HaTosefet, the addition. This preserves some of the others. But, better read the scholars on that. So who would like to read the Tosefta here?
I will.
Thank you, Ricky.
It's better for a person to live in Eretz Yisrael in a city where the majority are idol worshippers, rather than outside the land, even in a city that is completely Jewish. This teaches that living in Eretz Yisrael is equal to all the mitzvot of the Torah.
Yeah, so that's a pretty strong statement, particularly in comparison to our, the verse that Ramban had drawn on, and the whole context. Like, if you want to deserve to live in the land, you got to get rid of all of the inhabitants because they're going to be a snare for you. And here, you're better in Eretz Yisrael, when the majority of idol worshippers, and outside the land, even in the city, it's a majority Jewish. And again, the notion, Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael shkula keneged kol mitzvot Shabbat Torah. And there are, I don't know, I wouldn't push this too far, but I think it's not too distant from how some contemporary Israelis or Israelis in our time have thought, we don't have to observe Torah because we're living in Eretz Yisrael. And I think there is something unique about being in Eretz Yisrael. Nonetheless, it's still a strong statement. And the notion that living in Eretz Yisrael compares to the rest of the Torah that we find as well in Sifrei Devarim, a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy. And as Yehudi said, there are many statements in Deuteronomy that are much clearer actually than the verse that Ramban chooses. Like here's one of the Yashavta ba'artzam, you shall dwell in their land. Go on, Ricky.
And you have settled in their land. It happened that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Rabbi Matzia ben Heresh, Rabbi Chanina ben Achai, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yonatan, who went outside of the land. They arrived at Paltom.
I didn't have a chance to see what that refers to, but it's obviously a place outside of Eretz Yisrael.
And remembered Eretz Yisrael. They lifted their eyes, and their eyes flowed with tears. And they tore their garments and read this verse. And you have settled in their land. They returned to their place. They said, dwelling in Eretz Yisrael corresponds to all the mitzvot of the Torah.
And then, pretty much a parallel, kind of the same type of story.
And it happened with Rab Elazar ben Shamua and Rab Yochanan Hasandler, who were traveling in Nitzivim near Rab Yehuda ben Tetera to learn Torah from him. Arriving at Sidon,
I'm getting there.
In Phoenicia, they remembered Eretz Yisrael, whereupon they raised their eyes and wept and rent their garments and recited this verse. And you have settled in their land. They returned to their place, at which they said, dwelling in Eretz Yisrael corresponds to all the mitzvah of the Torah.
Okay, so, here, it's not an isolated idea in rabbinic literature, but, clearly there's a very strong, feeling towards living in Eretz Yisrael. I have no idea of the politics of what was going on when those statements were being written, but still,
Popky?
Yes.
The second statement is a little bit, we should check that one out, because Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera was alive at the time that the Beit HaMikdash was standing. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is a student of Rabbi Akiva, so something's not right with the story. I'm not exactly sure what's wrong there, but it should be checked out. If to make sure that there's not some kind of something's not, the girsa is really correct.
Yeah, well, as you can see, they in the Hebrew they have it marked. They had the wrong verse, and they don't read this but read that. In the parentheses,
Well,
you ignore.
Remember, that's what I was saying. The one from A beats that one by a mile.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
That's exactly the verse I meant.
Yep.
But this one's okay. The first one's fine. But the second one, when you get to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, that's a little strange. Okay. Something's not right there. And I just, we should check that one out.
Yeah. Obviously it's kind of an imitation of the previous one. And maybe they put in Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera because he was in the one before. It's also, it's in Sifrei, but, it's still, to some extent, Midrash, or I should say Agadah. And, but, I sometimes,
that's what I mean.
Yeah. I do sometimes feel that statements are not necessarily halachic all the time, but they're really homiletic.
Yeah.
And I this strikes me, the section of Deuteronomy, I mean, in Sifrei Devarim strikes me as more sermonic than kind of a halachic. Okay, now we come to a famous section that the Ramban had quoted in Bavli of Ketubot. They're actually talking about documents and shtarei chov, documents of debt, but they move on to the notion of what can a husband force his wife to do, or as we'll see, vice versa. But first of all, the Mishnah. Who would like to read? Even if you've read before, you can read again. It's all right.
Okay,
Thanks, Susie.
I'll read. Mishnah, all bring up to Eretz Yisrael, but all may not remove.
Okay, and to kind of explain what that means, we have Rashi's comment.
Okay, all bring up. A man may force all the members of his household to go up and live with him in Jerusalem.
Okay, then we have another statement in the Mishnah.
All bring up to Jerusalem, but all may not remove. Both men and women may force the other spouse to immigrate to Eretz Yisrael or to move to Jerusalem.
Okay, you can notice that there's a lot more English to the Hebrew. The translation adds the explanation. The text just says, Achad hanashim v'achad hanashim. It applies to both spouses. This is a case where it's not just the husband can impose his will upon his wife, but she can also impose her will upon him. And here you have Rashi's comment.
Both men and women, even a woman may force her husband to go up and live there. If not, he must divorce her and give her ketubah, as is taught explicitly in the Breita in the Gemara.
So now we come to the Breita. There's more material here, but we're skipping down to the Breita. Breita is a teaching that's outside of the Mishnah or Tosefta, generally outside of the halachic midrashim. It exists in the Talmudim, but it's an early rabbinic teaching. You can see there. Pardon me?
It's a Tanaitic teaching.
Yeah, it begins with the introduction. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis or our sages taught. Generally, if there is a Taf Nun Aleph, somewhere, these are technical phrases in the Talmud, they are introducing some early tradition, generally a Tanaitic tradition. So go on. This is a Breita that appears later on in the Talmud discussing this Mishnah. Our sages taught.
Our sages taught, the husband says to go up and the wife says not to go up, they force her to go up. And if she will not, she is divorced without receiving her marriage contract.
But then...
Wait,
That's harsh.
she doesn't get a get?
Well, she gets a get.
Yes, yeah.
But she doesn't get her marriage contract. The marriage contract really refers to the financial and other things that she is owed by her husband.
Right, so she won't get that.
Right, if she refuses.
Okay.
But then,
go on.
Yeah, go on, one more line.
If she says that
sorry.
Yeah.
That should be.
No, it's okay.
Sorry. If she says to go up.
If she says to go up and he says not to go up, they force him to go up. If not, he must divorce her and give her the marriage contract. Okay.
So, she can go and she gets the ketubah.
Right.
Now, it should be mentioned, just to throw in a little bit of, how is this dealt with practically throughout history? Not everyone necessarily agreed, or they realized it was not always easy to fulfill this particular mitzvah. So the students of Rashi, his grandchildren, his students, called the Tosafot, comment on both the Talmud and Rashi's commentary, and they make this comment.
He says to go up, etc. It is not practiced in our times, as there is danger on the roads. And Rabbeinu Chaim says that today it is not a commandment to live in the land of Israel, as there are several commandments that are not dependent on the land,
That are
That are dependent.
Upon the land, and several punishments that we are not able to be careful about and be cognizant of.
So, here already we see that in the medieval era, not everyone saw this as a mitzvah that could be observed. Okay, let's go on with this Braita in the Talmud.
If she says to leave and he says not to leave, they force her not to leave. If not, she is divorced without her marriage contract.
And then the opposite, go on.
If he says to leave and she says not to leave, they force him not to leave. If not, she divorces her.
Well, it should be
He divorces her and gives her the marriage contract.
Yeah. So basically, there are all kind of parallel sections.
Right.
The bottom line being is that moving to Eretz Yisrael and living in Eretz Yisrael is so important that one spouse may force the other to do so. And if they are totally recalcitrant and they refuse, the couple can be divorced. And so much so, there's a penalty. Pardon me?
And there are significant financial penalties.
Yes.
Right.
Like, a fine.
Yeah. So again, this is a very pro-Zionist position, if you will. Now we have another statement that's pretty powerful. Again, may not be so much halachic as sermonic, but it's a very famous statement that continues a little bit later on in the Talmud.
I should read that one?
Yeah.
See?
Mhm.
Our sages taught a person should always reside in Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is mostly populated by Gentiles, and he should not reside outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that is mostly populated by Jews. For anyone who resides in Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who has a God, and anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who does not have a God. As it is stated, to give to you the land of Canaan to be your God.
Yeah, they see the connection, that verse in Vayikra, that, really living in Eretz Yisrael, that says you've got faith, that says that you believe in God. If you live outside of Israel, it's like you just don't have anything. Another pretty powerful statement.
So none of us have a God.
No.
No.
That's from the old days.
Yeah.
All right.
And let's just go on a little bit.
Okay.
Because then the Gemara itself asks the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can it really be said that anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael has no God? Rather, this comes to tell you that anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered as though he is engaged in idol worship.
So there you have it. It's not that we have no God. We're just worshiping idols.
Oh, baloney.
And here they have a statement. They base it on a particular verse. When David is running away from Shaul.
And so it says with regard to David, for they have driven me out this day that I should not cleave to the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. But who said to David, go serve other gods? Rather, this comes to tell you that anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered as though he is engaged in idol worship.
Okay, so I mean, I think, as I said, this is probably more homiletic than halachic. As Yehudi said, it's poetic. These are obviously very, very strong statements.
Mhm.
I think
And
we should say a little more about the first, Rabbi Papa, because the second verse, the one from 1 Samuel, is
uh-huh,
I think the thing that this is what. So in other words, what David? Here's the scene. David's on the run from Saul, was trying to kill him. Okay, that we all know that story,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And David basically has to run from place to place. His pictures in every post office, wanted
yeah,
$10 million reward, and a point is reached where Saul's armies seem to be right on his heel wherever he goes to in Eretz Israel. And you have to understand that this is chapter 26 of Shmuel. In chapter 27, David gives up and he leaves Eretz Israel and goes to live with the Philistines. So this statement is introducing what he feels he's being forced to do. In other words, David is saying that if I'm being forced to live out of Eretz Israel against my will, just to save my life, it's as if I was forced to worship other gods, okay, against my will, just to save my life. That's really that's why this is such a strong verse, because it says in Hebrew, Lemor, lech avod Elohim acherim. Quote, that's what Lemor means.
yeah,
Go worship other gods. That's a very strong statement. You have pushed me out. You have kicked me out of the country. Even I can't even touch it. Can't even walk in it without being arrested. Well, that's the truth. He can't. So he ends up having to leave. So that, in other words, I think from what I've heard so far from the group, it sounds like people think that what the point of this statement is to say that a person who lives outside Eretz Israel is an idol worshiper. That's not the point. The point, the person who's forced out of Eretz Israel, who wants to live there, is going to react very strongly. I'm going to say it's as if you forced me to worship idols. Okay? And again, another thing about the statement of Zionism, let's make sure we understand. The Herzl form of Zionism never made it sound like if a person lived outside of the future Jewish state, they were in any way sinning or doing something wrong. That's the Ben-Gurion version, okay? The Herzl version never ever implied anything of the sort. That even Ben-Gurion, who doesn't even believe in God, can't really go around talking about sinning against God. All Ben-Gurion could say is a Jew, if you want to be a full Jew, they should live in Israel. I agree with that statement, even though I don't live there. Okay. In other words, I find that statement to be absolutely true.
No, we're going to come to more contemporary, positions on this in a moment. Also, by the way, though, it's in talking about being able to force one's spouse to go to Eretz Yisrael or not to leave. That's kind of how the Shulchan Aruch rules.
Mhm.
So they include that in the Shulchan Aruch. It's not
attention.
necessarily what the Isser list totally agrees to, but this is, it's just important to recognize that this is enshrined in a certain way in Jewish law. And he's talking about forcing someone to go, and the Shulchan Aruch says, "Lamed dvarim amorim." What is this talking about? And again, it's in the context of a husband moving his wife from place to place. From where may he move her? Where may he not? And they talk about what kind of conditions. Anywhere. So the Shulchan Aruch explains, "May chutz la'aretz lechutz la'aretz," from within, from going outside the land to outside the land. Like, you move somebody from Detroit to Los Angeles, or from, Paris to Barcelona. Oma Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, from, Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, from Haifa to Sderot. I don't know. Aval mechutz la'aretz la'eretz Yisrael kofino tola alot. But from outside the land to the land of Israel, you force her. He's using the feminine here. You force her to make aliyah. Afilu minaveya felinave hara. Even from a really beautiful place to a bad place, an ugly place. Vafilu memakom sherubo Yisrael, even from a place where the majority are Jews, lemakom sherubo kutim, where the majority are non-Jews. Ve'ein motzi'in me'eretz Yisrael lechutz la'aretz, and you don't force someone to go out to go out of the land from Eretz Yisrael. Vafilu minaveh hara lenaveh hatov, not even from a nice place, from a bad place to a good place. Vafilu mimakom sherubo kutim lemakom sherubo Yisrael, from a place that is mostly non-Jews to a place that's mostly Jews. So, I don't know. So again, these are characteristics earlier on in the text of the Shulchan Aruch, but he's following along the rabbinic literature fairly faithfully. Okay, now we turn to a contemporary halachic work, and I'm bringing this in simply because he quotes our verse, and he's following Ramban explicitly. Who would like to read?
I will.
Thank you.
This is what was said, and you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess, and you shall take possession. The intention is capture and sovereignty. Settle, the intention is its settlement, that it should not be desolate. And thus it is said, when you have occupied it and settled in it.
Again, a verse from Deuteronomy.
Therefore, the Ramban defined the mitzvah. We were commanded to take possession of the land that God, may he be exalted, gave to our ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, not to leave it in the hands of others from among the nations or desolate.
And these were from his additions to Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot. So, I brought this in, here's a relatively contemporary halachic work, which brings in a number of halachic opinions, apparently. But, for this one, and Dafka mentions our verse, this is the notion of what we are supposed to do. Now, here is the statement from the Masorti movement's website.
A revolution has occurred in Judaism, a revolution that we still live with and benefit from. In our eyes, participation in this revolution is among the most important mitzvot in our days. It is incumbent upon every Jew to contribute his share. Of course, there is no contribution greater than full participation, that is, Aliyah. The Masorti movement sees Aliyah, therefore, as a goal for every Jew, and demands dedication, effort, and resources to educate all the Jews of the diaspora to all the updates on what is happening in Zion, so that each one may choose his or her path to define for him or herself the measure on one's participation in the Zionist revolution.
Okay, now obviously, they're emphasizing the highest value is Aliyah, and yet at the same time, trying to put in nice language, those who do not, what is the role of people who do not make Aliyah? And as Yodi mentioned, the differences between Ben Gurion and Herzl, certainly in the conservative movement, these issues have definitely been present. Now, unlike certain parts of Orthodoxy and Reform, the conservative movement was not from its inception anti-Israel. In fact, there were a lot of connections to Israel between the different scholars in the movement. While it was still under, it was the mandate. Simon Greenberg, alav shalom, my teacher, studied at Hebrew University, and even before it really became a requirement in the rabbinical school, most rabbis, if not all, ended up studying in Israel, if before their actual rabbinic studies, and sometimes during their rabbinical studies. So, it's very clear there has been a very strong Zionist trend in conservative Judaism. In fact, in a conference on Ramah in the 80s at the seminary, no one had done an official study but it was clear that there was a large segment of Ramah campers or people who have been involved with Ramah who ended up making Aliyah. And this, I mean, I can think of some of my friends from my Edah, from my division, who have made Aliyah. And I can think of any number of teachers and counselors and various people who have made Aliyah. They've been Chayalim Bodedim. Well, actually, many of you know Marilyn Silverstein's daughter. Is it Marilyn Silverstein? Was very involved in our shul.
Silvershine.
The gift shop.
Silvershine?
No, not
Silvershine.
Marilyn Silvershine,
Okay, just be sure.
because she's down in Florida, and thankfully still with us. This woman passed away relatively young. She was very much in charge of the gift shop. One of the plaques has her name. And
Oh,
her
this is
daughter,
the one that,
and her daughter lives in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Myra Silverman.
Myra
Myra
Silverman.
Myra
thank you.
Silverman.
Silverman.
Yes,
Right,
sorry.
And Myra, yeah.
Oh,
And you always mention, Ed, when you're reading the list of people, you know, for Refuah Shlema. Is he okay?
I really don't know.
But her husband, Ed?
Yeah.
Ed
Yeah.
Silverman remarried.
Right.
Ed
right.
remarried.
Yeah, but I'm not
Myra
asking that.
died.
Yeah.
Myra died in the year 2000, I think, or 2001 at the latest. And Ed remarried.
But
And
I'm
one
not
daughter
asking
lives
that.
in Israel and one daughter lives in
Nantucket.
Cape
Rabbi
Cod or somewhere
Yes.
around there.
Nantucket.
What Rabbi Popky said before, I think we should just make it a little more clear what this is. The conservative movement has never had.
Well, actually, can I just finish what I was saying, by the way?
Okay, fine. By all
Yeah.
means.
So, and I was just using the example of her daughter, who lives in Yerushalayim, and actually is literally her apartment is next door to my best friend's apartment. Her first husband, well, right now is, you know, just her ex-husband. He's from Ramah Poconos. He made Aliyah. He was a Chayal Boded and a lone soldier, you know, and, you know, there's an example of someone who made Aliyah. But there's also been a little bit of discomfort with the Zionism. You know, first of all, New York saw itself as the center of the world, and the seminary in particular. So, you know, they used to joke, you know, Kime New York Tetzei Torah. And that means, you know, from New York came forth Torah. I mean, the line from our prayers is Kime Tzion Tetzei Torah, from Zion. And, you know, Ramah always had a group of Israelis that came in to work in the camp. And some of us became very friendly with them. They were really connected. And so there was a lot of talk about Israel, and, you know, it became, I don't think it's the same today, but it was kind of normal for people to automatically, first of all, after all your years as a camper at Ramah, you went on Ramah seminar. You went to Israel with Ramah. That was my first trip to Israel. And then people would already, okay, oh yeah, I'm going to go to Israel with Ramah, then I'm going to go spend a year at Hebrew U. You know, it just was kind of understood this is what you do. Now, when people went to Israel, the staff in Israel were very often Americans. I mean, there were a lot of Israelis too, obviously, but there were a lot of Americans who were at this point Israelis. They had made Aliyah, and they had some very strong feelings. And so there would be discussions during our seminar year about the possibility of making Aliyah. Now, I don't know that, and you know, people could take it in a hard sell or soft sell. You know, I thought nothing of it. You know, like, yeah, you know, look, we've got a modern state of Israel. Why not? We have friends here. We come here. What's the big idea that we should be able to make Aliyah, that should be an option in Jewish life? Well, a lot of parents were not always happy with that, because the kids come back turned on, oh, I want to make Aliyah. Well, when you come back at 16 and want to make Aliyah, yeah, okay. It becomes a little bit more challenging if they come back from their junior year abroad or from other years in Israel. So, there is, as Zionistic as the movement has been, and there are pockets of very strong Zionism, there's often been a bit of pushback. And it's very much, and I'll let Yehudi continue about, what is the perspective of American Jewry as opposed to Israeli Jewry? So Yehudi, you wanted to make a
I
comment?
just wanted to say, as for a person who basically doesn't have real roots in the conservative movement, one of the things that I always thought was praiseworthy about it was that there's no political wing in the conservative movement that was ever against the Zionist idea. Now, when I say the Zionist idea, what I mean is not that every Jew should live in Israel. What I mean is that Jewish people should have a state of its own in the territory of Israel, and that any Jew who wants to live there should be welcome there. That's the Herzl Zionism, not the Ben Gurion Zionism. Now, both Orthodoxy and Reform had political wings that were actually against going on Aliyah.
Right.
Okay, Orthodoxy had a Satmar crowd and a few others, and Reform had a much more powerful group called the American Council for Judaism.
Yep.
And the publisher of the New York Times was a member of this group. And the New York Times basically has followed an anti-Israel policy. This isn't something that just started. It's been like that from day one. In other words, they've always been against the idea of a Jewish state, a state based on a religion, like if we don't have so many other states in the world that have established churches, et cetera, but they didn't like it. The Reform movement wanted people to see America as its Zion. America's the promised land. And I would say the Reform movement only started to basically move in the direction of Zionism when Hitler came into the picture. And even then, it was almost a revolution when Abigail Silber of Cleveland, Ohio, finally pulled the Reform movement out from under Stephen Wise, and essentially made it through the majority in the direction of supporting the Zionist movement. So I always admired conservative Judaism because there was no political wing in conservative Judaism that was against the Jews having a state of their own. The issue about whether you preach to kids who go on a year to Israel, whether that they should come, that's a different issue altogether. Right. That's a question of how the movement wants to run its program. That's nothing to do with the, with what the movement stands for.
Yeah. And although, there has been some uneasy tension, I remember, even both when I was Gabbai at Neve Shechter at our seminary in Israel, and also when I was Gabbai at the seminary in New York, what do we do on Yom HaAtzmaut? There were certain things that, the Israeli rabbinate took very seriously the notion of Israel as Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. And, they said we should blow shofar on Yom HaAtzmaut. And
what year was this, Rabbi Paul?
This was in the early 80s.
Because that Ani Tfilati Siddur that I purchased, I think in 2009, clearly, supports saying Hallel and Yom HaAtzmaut. That's a Masorti publication.
Oh yeah, well, but that's what I'm saying. There's this evolution. So even Reuven Hammer, alav shalom, who really was, one of the pioneers and hardest working individuals from Masorti Judaism in Israel. He led the Schechter Institute. Oh, wonderful, wonderful man and teacher. And I asked him, do we blow shofar? And he said, no, that's too messianic. That changed. And I happened to be Gabbai in New York the year that Shaul Lieberman, the great Talmudist, passed away. I had everybody joked the longest honeymoon because he came back. I mean, he would spend between Pesach and Simchat Torah in Israel. And he came back rather late after Simchat Torah that year. And he left a little early for Pesach. Sadly, he passed away on the plane to Israel.
Ooh.
So, but when he died, he was in charge of the synagogue at the seminary. When he passed away, none of the professors wanted to make a decision. Like, no, I don't want to be seen as, I mean, they didn't say this, but we knew it. No one wanted to be seen as trying to step into Lieberman's place. So they would always turn to me and say, Makatu Baluach, what's written in the Luach? And I made some decisions, but a couple of times I asked, and do we do full Psuke de Zimra? And I asked Simon Greenberg, who himself, made Aliyah at the end of his life and was quite Zionistic. He helped create the Neve Shechter. He said, no, we got to get the classes, but it's amazing how that has changed. And, Yehudi is in your, in the Masorti Sidor, of course, it's very different. And we'll see what happens with the weekday Lev Shalem. Okay, I just want to share with you, we don't have a lot of time. And again, I just happened to come across this. This is a statement made by an Orthodox rabbi, clearly a Zionist Orthodox rabbi. And it's interesting because he draws on Ramban. Again, all of this goes back to Ramban, who is reading Aliyah, or living in Israel, I should say, as a mitzvah. And it's called...
The Ramban followed his own advice. Let's put that in too.
No, that's, yeah. Now, again, why Israel is also
He's a lot further away from Israel than the Rambam was.
Yeah.
Rambam lived in Egypt.
Egypt, right.
Whereas the Ramban had to come from Spain to go to Eretz Israel. But he went there and he died there.
And it's, that's also something to remember in terms of the Zionist pull. And I'm using Zionism here in a very, very general term, not in the political term, but love of Zion and commitment to Eretz Yisrael and a Medina, a state, Israel is a political expression that, Jews throughout history have made Aliyah. Ramban being a good example. There were communities that made Aliyah, individual scholars. Certainly you had the influx of Jews following the expulsion from Spain. The Ottoman Empire said, yeah, you can come in. And that's when they developed the Shmata business up in Tzfat, which also brought in this whole school of Kabbalists. So, people have been connected to Israel. And I just found this, it's not necessarily the most articulate or most beautiful statement, but just kind of interesting in the way he talks about some things. And apparently it says here, the words of the rabbi in his visit to Buffalo, New York, in a particular year. And he said these words actually originally in English. I just happened to find them in Hebrew. Just before his Aliyah to Israel. And here he says, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to really translate it. You can correct my mistakes along the way. The Rambam, in his additions to the Sefer Mitzvot of the Rambam, distinguishes breaks up the mitzvah of dwelling in Israel into three parts. That is, there are three levels to Tzionut, Zionism. There is the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. A Jew must live in Eretz Yisrael, not in Paris or Buffalo. This is what's called Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael, dwelling in the land of Israel. There are many Haredi rabbis who have ruled that one must live in Israel, and then he gives a list of a number of them. I didn't include all of their sources. Uh, However, I'm down here. Amnam yesha omrim she'ein mitzvah legor ba'aretz. There are those who say that it's not a mitzvah to live in Israel. And one of his examples, Kamo Harabi me Satmar, the Harabi me Lubavitch. You know, the Satmar rabbi and the Lubavitch rabbi. The rabbi from Lubavitch tells a story about a Chassid who wanted to make Aliyah to Israel and to establish here in Torah and work, and ask the third rabbi, the Tzemach Tzedek, who is the third rabbi in the Lubavitch dynasty, about that. And that Lubavitch rabbi answered him, make Eretz Yisrael here in the United States, you know, where you live. They agree, Satmar and Lubavitch, that Eretz Yisrael is a holy place, but they claim that it is not a mitzvah to settle there.
Oh, it's one.
Also, you know, something that's not always known about Lubavitch, they're much more open to Israel today. Let's, you know, but, you know, you probably, you know, if you have a communal celebration, you probably won't have one of the rabbis from Lubavitch singing the Hatikvah. You know, you're not necessarily going to find them doing the prayer for Israel. Now, I don't want to make a blanket statement because I've hardly been in every single Chabad synagogue across the United States. And I don't know what happens Chabad in Israel. But, you know, there is this certainly very strong strain, not like Satmar. Satmar is really certainly anti-political Zionism. So second, according to this rabbi, of how Ramban sets up the hierarchy, there is a mitzvah to build up, really to really create settlement and build up the land. We have to build roads and houses, plant fields and vineyards, and in the language of the Ramban, that it should not be left desolate. This is what's called Yishuv Haaretz. And there are Bei Haridim, many Haredi Jews, like the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov, that came to live in the land, but they did not say that it was a mitzvah to establish settlements and to plant vineyards. In other words, you can go live there, but you don't have to be involved with building it up. But the Chazon Ish, who greatly supported the building up of the land, and therefore he also supported the kibbutzim of Agudat Yisrael, which was an Orthodox political party. So that's like another step that he shows. Yesh mitzvah lichbosh et haaretz. It is a mitzvah to conquer the land, and it's forbidden to leave it to the leadership or the rule of others. In the language of the Ramban, that it should be not left in the hands of others. Eretz Yisrael must be under our sovereignty. This is what is called Medinat Yisrael. Medinat Yisrael hi mitzvah. It is a mitzvah to have a state. Yesh mitzvah lakim medina, to establish a state, an army, a police force. Almost all the Haredim do not support this. And this is what is defined as Zionism. So he sees all of these different elements within Ramban's statement of the mitzvah, and also describing how the Orthodox world, or parts of the Orthodox world, have dealt with it. And how interesting.
Ultra-Orthodox world.
Ultra-Orthodox world, that's true.
Because the Orthodox world is totally supportive of this.
Oh, yeah. You know, I mean,
people are just a fringe in the Orthodox world.
Right.
No.
Yeah, that's very important to state. And he gives this great little story here. Baron Rothschild was not a Zionist, but he had merit. For when our rabbi Rav Kook eulogized him, he said that he was a divine messenger to renew the settlement of the land, but he was not a Zionist. Herzl was a Zionist because he worked to establish the state. Rothschild opposed Herzl and thought he was wasting his time. But both of them were true words. That is, we need Sionut Ma'asit, we need practical Zionism to go up and to build the land. And on this foundation, we have to establish the state. So,
by the way, in America today, we basically have the same idea. If you can't live in Israel, then you contribute to it, like Rothschild did.
Yeah, and that's
what Rothschild's merits are that he financed the deal of what ended up being the practical side of setting up, Yishuvim in Eretz Israel. That's why Rav Kook is making a special thing about his funeral. He put his money where his mouth was.
So I mean, it goes on, but we've reached the end of our time. He talks about different rabbis and their opinions, and that some Hasidic rabbis were a little bit more revolutionary in their approach and supporting in some way. And he just ends, if so, it's not the wisdom or cleverness that establishes, but the quality. Baruch Hashem, we have a state, we have an army, we have a police, we have a strong economy, we have a land that flowers and impresses, and greatly impresses.
The list. No, you're reading Hiroshima, Hiroshima as Hiroshima.
Oh,
Hiroshima is the list.
And the list goes on. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I did the same thing last night when I was reading this. I'm saying this doesn't really make sense. And then, yeah, the Hiroshima Aruka, because there's so many things. And I just found this interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing.
Shlomo Aviner is not a Haredi rabbi.
No, not at all.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's strange that he's sitting there quoting all these Haredim, unless he's writing a tshuva that's designed to just explore what these people have to say.
Yeah, I mean, he's really just speaking in a synagogue. This is his lesson. But I mean, I just found it was very interesting. And he mentions our Ramban, and important to realize that there's a lot in our parasha, and I don't want to minimize all the other stuff. But the whole notion of taking this one verse, although Ramban could have chosen better verses, as this kind of source for yeshivat haaretz, living in Israel, the idea of living in Israel as being a mitzvah, is not something to be discounted. This is something that's very serious in our tradition. And not just in orthodoxy or political Zionism, but in our own movement. And I firmly believe that every Jew should contemplate the possibility of Aliyah. It's a more realistic possibility for those of us living today than almost any other time in history. It doesn't mean that it's possible for everyone to move to Israel. There are all kinds of reasons why people cannot, including financial. It's like the old joke, how do you become a millionaire in Israel? Start off with 2 million. But it's still an important mitzvah. And, if we could, we make Aliyah. But if not, there are other ways to support Israel, and it's still crucial to our identity. Hence the discussion we had yesterday, in terms of the article by Giltroy and Sharansky on the un-Jews. Or we could also say the editors of the New York Times, that, how do we,
now.
pardon me?
They did the ultimate and became Episcopalians.
Yeah.
But the New
It's,
York Times ownership is today. You know.
Well, that was
most
that was the goal, to be imitate the Episcopalians. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat
Thank
Thank you
shalom.
very much.
Thank you,
Take
Rabbi.
care. Bye.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.